The Holy Gospel this morning is found in St. Mark in the 9th chapter. Now, 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could possibly bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who was talking to Jesus. And then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good that we're here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He didn't know what to say because they were terrified. Well, then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud came a voice. "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." And suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. Now, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them to tell nobody what they had seen until after the Son of Man had been risen from the dead. The Gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. Now, I am sure in all the time that the disciples were with Jesus, they never heard him offer a more comforting sentence than coming down that mountain when he said, "Now remember, whatever you just saw, don't tell anybody." Because I'm sure all 3 of them said, "No problem, boss. No problem at all." Because what did they see, of course? What they saw, they couldn't describe. Now, they thought that there was Jesus, but he changed somehow. Mark uses the word transfigured, whatever that means. So it was Jesus, but it wasn't Jesus. It was something that when they recollected back, he was different, but they didn't know how. And then his clothes, they were white, but they were beyond white. There's white, and then there's this kind of white. The kind of white that actually defies description. And of course, the way Mark tells the story, when Peter blurts out, "Hey, you guys are all standing, let's build some chairs." He did it because he didn't know what to say. He was, quite frankly, terrified. So when Jesus tells them after this has happened, "Don't tell anybody," they were like, "Well, that's not going to be an issue, boss, because quite frankly, we're not quite sure what we saw." And what did they see? I wonder, when they saw Jesus transfigured on that mountain 2,000 years ago, if they didn't see finally why we're all here. That what was revealed to them on that mountaintop is what has been revealed to us. The grand, the awesome, that there are no words to describe it, no colors to color it in, love that God has for you and me. That the love of God, when we experience it, it just defies description. It terrifies us because it is so awesome in its majesty and yet so tender in its intimacy. It strikes at us in our hearts in ways that we just can't describe. About 24 years ago, my wife had been in labor for about 20 hours when they decided to have a cesarean section for our first daughter. Now, all things considered, I never had a real desire to see my wife's bladder, but there it was. As she was under anesthesia and they opened her up and pulled Rachel from her womb. You know, there was so much going on there, I can't even really remember it. It's been 24 years now. I know there were a lot of people there because it was 4 o'clock in the morning. There was nothing else going on in the hospital, so anybody who had nothing to do was just there. They were like, hey, let's go watch the cesarean. There was some guy in the corner, for example, having a donut. Yeah, I think he was the FedEx delivery guy, actually. So they took my daughter and they put her in this incubator. And then all of a sudden, as they started to put my wife's bladder back and start sewing her up, they wheeled my daughter out of the room. And a nurse came over to me and said, you've got to go see your daughter. She's not breathing. We're taking her up to the intensive care unit. And I was like, what? What do you, where, what? And I could see the incubator going down this hallway through the window, but there was my wife just laying there, and I was just like, I can't leave her. Her insides are all out. What are you talking about? And the nurse said, you have to go, and she was pulling on my arm, and I was like, I can't go. I got her. And the anesthesiologist, he just grabbed my hand, and he said, Scott, I'll take care of your wife. Go with your daughter. So the nurse dragged me down this hall, and we started running after this incubator, and it was like one of those scenes in a movie where, like, every time I got in the hallway, the incubator turned another corner, and we'd have to run the next, and then would turn, and eventually I wound up on the 4th floor in front of the neonatal intensive care unit, and through the windows I could see my daughter back there, and she was hooked up to all these tubes and wires, and I wanted to rush in there, but they said, no, wait, you can't go in there, you have to wash up first, and so they made me stand there and count to 30 while I scrubbed my hands, or they dressed me in these gowns and booties. And there she was. And the nurse said, as I was scrubbing up, she said, your daughter wasn't breathing. So I went through the doors and walked down to where she was. And all the nurses that were in this place, they were all kind of laughing and joking and playing with this little newborn baby, just minutes old. Turns out, she was breathing, and they picked her up. And they said, you're the dad? And I said, yeah. And they put her in my arms, my hands. Now, I can't remember exactly what it was. I know there were some colors there, some blues and greens, and there were wires, but it was the most precious thing I had ever seen in my life. I'd never, to think that somehow this little child came from something, from me. I couldn't ever imagine anything more impressive than this little baby girl. And I swear, she asked for the car keys. I don't remember much about that day other than what I just told you. It's kind of a blur. But I do know that in my heart, it was the most wonderful thing I'd ever seen. Until about 10 days ago. Because 10 days ago in another hospital, here in Omaha, I walked into another hospital room. And this time, that now 24-year-old daughter was giving birth herself. And watching your daughter give birth is even more impressive than when I held her in my hands. To know that someone that I had cared about, that I had helped raise, that I loved beyond my wildest imagination, and to see her be a mom, it was the greatest day of my life. and everything that came together of 24 years of living with this young woman, and to see her mom there. I can't describe it. Now, I know that some of you are parents and grandparents. I know your grandkids are all in second place after mine. I get that. And I know that you've had love in your life, whether it's with your own children or your spouses or close friends. But to look back on it, it defies description. That love, that's the kind of love those guys saw on that mountain 2,000 years ago. The kind of love that goes way beyond anything we can describe. The kind of love that finally makes sense as to why we are all here. The love that God has for you. And in each of our futures lives a sense and a hope that just like I held my daughter, God will hold us and the tears will flow. Amen.